Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I have people every single day on Fox News and everywhere posting that I am a threat to this country. So I know what fear looks like. The masjid I pray in Minnesota got bombed by 2 domestic white terrorists.
As the House passes a broad resolution condemning anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bigotry, and other forms of hate, we'll hear from Congresswoman Ilhan Omar in her own words. Her recent comments on U.S. foreign policy on Israel sparked an intense debate in the House about anti-Semitism, but little attention has been paid to her larger message. Plus, we get a response to the House resolution from Israeli journalist Gideon Levy in Tel Aviv, Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, and Palestinian poet and activist Remy Kanazi here in New York. And on this International Women's Day, we speak with the Mexican-American author Valeria Luiselli, author of the new novel, The Lost Children Archive.
These children coming from Central America are not to be even seen as migrants, as young migrants, but as refugees because of the situation that they are fleeing. They are trying to seek asylum here. They turn themselves into Border Patrol and seek asylum. They're not here trying to get in illegally. They don't want to remain undocumented. No one does. It's not the destiny that anyone really desires.
Valeria Luiselli was just longlisted for the 2019 Women's Prize for Fiction. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A federal judge in Virginia sentenced Donald Trump's former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, Thursday to 47 months in prison for 8 counts of bank fraud and tax evasion, far less than the 19 to 24-year prison term recommended by federal sentencing guidelines. U.S. District Judge T.S. Ellis, who was nominated to the bench by President Ronald Reagan, called the sentencing guidelines outlined by special counsel Robert Mueller's team excessive and said Manafort had led an otherwise blameless life. In response, New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, Paul Manafort getting such little jail time for such serious crimes lays out for the world how it's almost impossible for rich people to go to jail for the same amount of time as someone who is lower income. In our current broken system, justice isn't blind, it's bought, she tweeted. Paul Manafort faces a second sentencing hearing at a federal court in the District of Columbia next week on 2 additional counts of conspiracy. The House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed a resolution Thursday condemning anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim discrimination, white supremacy, racism, and other forms of hate. The vote was 407 to 23, with nearly 24 Republicans voting against it. The vote capped a week of intense debate among congressional Democrats that began after some lawmakers accused Democratic Congressmember Ilhan Omar of invoking anti-Semitic tropes while questioning U.S. foreign policy on Israel. At an event last week, Omar said, quote, I want to talk about political influence in this country that says it's okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country. Democrat Eliot Engel, chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, then accused Omar of making a, quote, vile anti-Semitic slur. The House leadership initially drafted a resolution condemning anti-Semitism and was seen as a direct rebuke of Omar. But many progressive Democrats said Omar, who is one of the first 2 Muslim congresswomen in U.S. history, was unfairly being singled out. Later in the broadcast, we'll hear from Tel Aviv. We'll speak with the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy and Washington, D.C. and New York for a discussion about Congressmember Ilhan Omar's comments and the resolution that was passed yesterday. In Venezuela, President Nicolas Maduro is blaming the U.S. government for a prolonged power outage that plunged most of the country into darkness Thursday. Maduro says anti-government saboteurs backed by the U.S. took the nation's main hydroelectric power station at the Guri Dam offline. The blackout compounded the misery of Venezuelans already enduring a severe economic crisis amidst crippling U.S.-led sanctions. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo blamed Maduro's government for the outage and threatened regime change in a flurry of tweets, one of which read, no food, no medicine, now no power, next no Maduro. Meanwhile, President Trump's special envoy to Venezuela, Elliot Abrams, told a Senate panel Thursday the Trump administration will sanction banks that trade with the Maduro government.
A number of financial institutions already, and we're going to expand the net. We have under consideration other institutions which I won't name because we don't want them to get advance notice, but there will be more sanctions on financial institutions that are carrying out the orders of the Maduro regime to steal funds from Venezuela and hide it all around the world.
On Thursday, 16 progressive House Democrats, including Ro Khanna, Ilhan Omar, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, sent a letter to Secretary of State Pompeo condemning U.S. threats of military intervention in Venezuela and U.S. sanctions. The letter read, in part, the president's recent economic sanctions threaten to exacerbate the country's grave economic crisis, causing immense suffering for the most vulnerable in society who bear no responsibility for the situation in the country, they wrote. Israel's election committee has banned an alliance of Israeli Arab parties from fielding candidates in April's general election. The move will bar candidates from the Balad United Arab List, which represents Palestinian citizens of Israel, from running for Israel's parliament, the Knesset. The ban was celebrated by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who said in a statement, those who support terrorism will not be in the Israeli Knesset. Palestinian candidate Heba Yazbak said the measure had nothing to do with terror and was instead aimed at stifling Palestinian rights.
They are actually banning the Arab to choose by themselves their representatives and their leaders. We of course will go to the High Court, and we will continue until the end, and we will not accept this discrimination against us and against the Arab people in Israel.
The ban on Israeli Arab candidates came as Israel's election committee said it would allow members of the far-right Jewish Power Party to run in April's election. The party's tied to the Jewish Defense League, a far-right group that was classified in 2000 by the FBI as a right-wing terrorist group. This all comes as Israel's attorney general says he's prepared to indict Netanyahu on corruption charges. In France, a court Thursday sentenced Cardinal Philippe Barbarin, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Lyon, to a 6-month suspended prison sentence for failing to act on the sexual abuse of Boy Scouts in his diocese. The Archbishop was found guilty of failing to report allegations of abuse in the 80s and 90s by a priest who's set to go on trial later this year. In climate news, a new study finds rainstorms are becoming far more frequent across Greenland, even in winter, accelerating the melting of vast areas of ice and setting the stage for global sea level rise that could inundate coastal areas home to hundreds of millions of people. The study, published in the journal Cryosphere, found warmer temperatures have led to increased rainfall in Greenland, which triggers widespread ice melt and runoff, contributing to the 270 billion tons of Greenland's ice added each year to the Earth's oceans. U.S. Army whistleblower Chelsea Manning says she's headed to federal court today, where she'll face possible jail time for criminal contempt after she declined to offer questions before a grand jury to answer questions. Manning says she was subpoenaed by federal prosecutors in Virginia's Eastern District to appear for questioning Wednesday about her 2010 release to WikiLeaks of hundreds of thousands of State Department and Pentagon documents about the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Last year, the prosecutors inadvertently revealed they've indicted WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange under a sealed indictment, but the charges against Assange remain unknown. In Sacramento, California, protests are continuing over the police killing of Stephon Clark, a 22-year-old unarmed African-American who was shot dead in his grandmother's backyard last year. Demonstrations erupted over the weekend after county prosecutors said they would not press criminal charges against the officers who unleashed 20 bullets at Clark within just 7 seconds and waited for over 5 minutes before approaching him to administer medical attention. On Tuesday, angry residents protested the killing at Sacramento's city council meeting, briefly disrupting proceedings. And on Thursday, hundreds of students from Sacramento City College and C.K. McClatchy High School walked out of classes to protest the decision not to prosecute the officers who killed Stephon Clark. In Florida, a jury in West Palm Beach found former police officer Norman Raja guilty Thursday of manslaughter and attempted murder for shooting and killing 31-year-old Corey Jones in October of 2015. Jones, who is African-American, was having car trouble and waiting for a tow truck when the officer drove the wrong way up a one-way ramp and approached him in an unmarked van. At the time, the officer was wearing plain clothes, did not identify himself as a police officer. Jones apparently feared he was being robbed, pulled out a legally purchased handgun. The officer then opened fire and shot Jones multiple times. The officer is the first on-duty Florida officer convicted in a shooting in 30 years. Police in Boulder, Colorado, have launched an internal affairs probe after video surfaced showing a white police officer drawing a pistol on a black man who was picking up trash outside his own home last week. The video shows the officer approaching the man who was using a trash picker and bucket to clean up his yard.
You're on my property with a gun in your hand, threatening to shoot me because I'm picking up trash. I hope that camera's on.
He's picking up trash and you have your hand on your gun? Go home.
In a police report, the officer claimed the man was uncooperative and unwilling to put down a blunt object, even though the man and his roommate repeatedly identified the object as a trash picker. The officer who drew his weapon has been placed on paid administrative leave pending the investigation. In New York City, prosecutors have dropped rape charges against a pair of officers accused of assaulting a woman they'd arrested and handcuffed in their police van in 2017. Prosecutors initially said former NYPD detectives Eddie Martins and Richard Hall raped 18-year-old Anna Chambers after stopping her car and finding a small amount of marijuana and a few anti-anxiety pills in her purse. Testing shows the DNA of both officers was found on the teenager who testified she was raped. The former officers claimed the acts were consensual as their defense. At the time, it was not unlawful for New York police officers to have sex with someone in their custody, although the law has since been changed to define such an act as rape. Prosecutors now say they'll seek to charge the men with official misconduct and bribery. In Erie, Pennsylvania, union workers have agreed to end their 9-day-old strike at a locomotive plant, the largest work stoppage at a U.S. factory since Donald Trump became president. In late February, more than 1,700 members of the United Electrical Workers Union decided to strike after the Wabtec company took control of their plant from GE and refused to honor the union's prior contract. Thursday's agreement will provide a 90-day window for the union and plant managers to negotiate a new collective bargaining agreement. El Salvador's Supreme Court has ordered the release of 3 women imprisoned under the country's anti-abortion laws, which are among the harshest in the world. The women were among dozens who've been sentenced to up to 30 years for abortion-related crimes. This is Alba Rodriguez, who was freed Thursday after more than 8 years in prison.
We thank the citizens associations, the national and international organizations that supported us, and we hope that the state also recognizes that there are many women inside here that are also innocent and, God willing, one day can gain their freedom too.
And women around the world are marking International Women's Day with protests for pay equity, reproductive rights, and an end to sexual violence. In Spain, thousands of women have gone on strike today to defend gender violence legislation against efforts by far-right politicians to repeal the landmark law. And in Paris, women gathered outside Saudi Arabia's embassy for a protest led by Amnesty International, demanding the release of jailed women activists in Saudi Arabia. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed a resolution Thursday condemning anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim discrimination, white supremacy, and other forms of hate. The vote was 407 to 23, with nearly 24 Republicans voting against it. The vote capped a week of intense debate among congressional Democrats that began after some lawmakers accused Democratic Congressmember Ilhan Omar of invoking anti-Semitic tropes while questioning U.S. foreign policy on Israel. At an event last week, Congressmember Omar said, quote, "I want to talk about political influence in this country that says it's okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country." Democrat Eliot Engel, chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, on which Ilhan Omar sits as well, then accused Omar of making a, quote, vile anti-Semitic slur. The House leadership initially drafted a resolution condemning anti-Semitism in what was seen as a direct rebuke of Omar. But many progressive Democrats and Omar, who was one of the first two Muslim congresswomen in U.S. history, was unfairly being singled out. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders wrote, "We must not equate anti-Semitism with legitimate criticism of the right-wing Netanyahu government in Israel." New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "Incidents like these do beg the question, where are the resolutions against homophobic statements, for anti-blackness, for xenophobia, for a member saying he'll send Obama home to Kenya?" Key members of the Congressional Black Caucus also questioned the treatment of Omar. The split within the Democratic Party forced the leadership to withdraw its initial anti-Semitism resolution and present a much broader one. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar voted for and praised the new resolution. She issued a joint statement with fellow Muslim lawmakers Rashida Tlaib of Michigan and Andre Carson of Indiana, saying, quote, "We're tremendously proud to be part of a body that's put forth a condemnation of all forms of bigotry, including anti-Semitism, racism, and white supremacy. Our nation is having a difficult conversation, and we believe this is great progress," they said. They went on to write, "Today is historic on many fronts. It's the first time we have voted on a resolution condemning anti-Muslim bigotry." Later in the show, we'll go to Tel Aviv and Washington for response to the controversy. But first, let's turn to Ilhan Omar in her own words, speaking last week at Busboys and Poets Restaurant in Washington, D.C. While the media has largely focused on a single sentence in her remarks, few have heard her broader comments. This is a part of what she said.
It almost as if every single time we say something, regardless of what it is we say, that is supposed to be about foreign policy, our engagement, our advocacy about ending oppression, or the freeing of every human life and wanting dignity, we get to be labeled in something, and that ends the discussion because we end up defending that, and nobody ever gets to have the broader debate of what is happening with Palestine. So for me, I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it is okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country. I want to ask, why is it okay for me to talk about the influence of the NRA, of fossil fuel industries, or Big Pharma, and not talk about a powerful lobbying group that is influencing policy? Right? I want to ask the question of why is it okay for you to push, for you to be, there's so many people. I mean, most of us are new, but many members of Congress have been there forever. Some of them have been there before we were born. So I know many of them were fighting for people to be freed, for people to live in dignity in South Africa. I know many of them fight for people around the world to have dignity, to have self-determination. So I know that they care about these things. But now that you have two Muslims who are saying, here is a group of people that we want to make sure they have the dignity that you want everybody else to have, we get to be called names and we get to be labeled as hateful? No, we know what hate looks like. We experience it every single day. I have colleagues who talk about death threats. And sometimes there are cities in my state where the gas stations have written on their bathrooms, "Assassinate Ilhan Omar." I have people driving around my district looking for my home, for my office, causing me harm. I have people every single day on Fox News and everywhere posting that I am a threat to this country. So I know what fear looks like. The masjid I pray in Minnesota got bombed by 2 domestic white terrorists. So I know what it feels to be someone who is of faith that is vilified. I know what it means to be of someone who is of ethnicity that is vilified. I know what it feels to be of a race, right? Like I am an immigrant, so I don't have the historical drama that some of my black sisters and brothers have in this country, but I know what it means for people to just see me as a black person and to treat me as less than a human. And so when people say, you are bringing hate, I know what their intention is. Their intention is to make sure that our lights are dimmed, that we walk around with our heads bowed, that we lower our face and our voice. But we have news for people. You can call us any kind of name. You can threaten us any kind of way. Rashida and I are not ourselves. Every single day we walk in the halls of Congress, we have people who have never had the opportunity to walk there walking with us. So we're here to say and represent the voices of people who have been silenced for many decades and generations. And we're here to fight for the people of our district who want to make sure that there is actual prosperity being guaranteed. Because there is a direct correlation between not having a clean water and starting endless wars. It's all about the profit and who gets benefit of it. There's a direct correlation. There's a correct correlation between corporations that are getting rich and the fact that we have students that are shackled with debt. There is a direct correlation between the White House and the people who are benefiting from having detention beds that are privatized. So what people are afraid of is not that there are 2 Muslims in Congress. What people are afraid of is that there are 2 Muslims in Congress that have their eyes wide open, that have their feet to the ground, that know what they're talking about, that are fearless, and that understand that they have the same election certificate as everyone else in Congress.
Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar speaking last week at Busboys and Poets in Washington, D.C. She was speaking just after Rashida Tlaib, the other Muslim congresswoman. Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib are the first 2 Muslim congresswomen in U.S. history. When we come back, we'll host a discussion on the debate sparked by Omar's comments. We'll go to Tel Aviv, to Washington, and New York. Stay with us.
Bolivia, Chile, Angola, Puerto Rico y Tunisia, Argelia, Venezuela, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Mozambique, Costa Rica, Camerún, Congo, Cuba, Somalia, México, República Dominicana, Tanzania, fuera Yankee de América Latina, franceses, ingleses y holandeses, yo te quiero libre. Palestina. الوضع بده الردع صار الوضع بده الردع لكن كثير بتحرر مستوطن بتلمس لكن مصافحة يد ألف كان ألف رقم هدار الإعلام سلاح.
So Mansour, We Are the South by Anna Tijoux featuring Shadia Mansour. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. On Thursday, the House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed a resolution condemning anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim discrimination, white supremacy, and other forms of hate. The resolution, as initially written, was seen as a direct rebuke of Democratic Congressmember Ilhan Omar for her comments about U.S. foreign policy with Israel. The vote capped a week of intense debate among congressional Democrats about anti-Semitism and U.S. policy on Israel. We're joined now by three guests. In Tel Aviv, Gideon Levy, longtime Israeli journalist, Haaretz columnist, member of the newspaper's editorial board. His latest piece headlined, "Keep It Up, Ilhan Omar." He's also the author of The Punishment of Gaza. Phyllis Bennis is with us in Washington. Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, serves on the National Board of Jewish Voice for Peace. Her recent piece for In These Times headlined, "Why False Accusations of Anti-Semitism Against Ilhan Omar Are So Harmful." And Remy Kanazi is with us here in New York, a Palestinian-American poet and activist, the author of a collection of poetry, Before the Next Bomb Drops, Rising Up from Brooklyn to Palestine. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Let's go to Tel Aviv first. Gideon Levy, your response to the debate and the final passage of the resolution on Thursday in the House of Representatives.
It's wonderful that the House deals with anti-Semitism. It's wonderful that the House condemns anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism should be condemned, but the context is very suspicious and very troubling. Let me be very frank with you, Amy. We have to say the truth. The Israeli lobby, the Jewish lobby, are by far too strong and too aggressive. It's not good for the Jewish community. It's not good for Israel. What is happening now is that some kind of fresh air, some kind of new voices are emerging from Capitol Hill, raising legitimate questions about Israel, about America's foreign policy toward Israel, and about the Israeli lobby in the States. Those are very legitimate questions, and it is more than needed to raise them. But the Israeli propaganda and the Jewish propaganda in recent years made it as a systematic method. Whenever anybody dares to raise questions or to criticize Israel, he is immediately and automatically labeled as anti-Semite, and then he has to shut his mouth, because after this, what can he say? This vicious circle should be broken, and I really hope that great politicians like Mrs. Omar and others will be courageous enough to stand in front of those accusations and to say, yes, it is legitimate to criticize Israel. Yes, it is legitimate to raise questions, and this does not mean that we are anti-Semites. We are not ready to play this game anymore in which they shut our mouths with those accusations, which in most of the cases are hollow.
What kind of effect does this debate? Now, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Andre Carson, the three Muslim Congress members, applauded the final resolution, saying it's the first time that there was this anti-Islamophobia resolution that was passed by the House of Representatives. Of course, in addition to the anti-Semitism issue, they broadened it out. What kind of effect does this debate have in Israel? And, you know, you're just about to have your elections. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is just about to be indicted for corruption.
Yeah, as you probably know, Amy, the campaign in Israel deals only with one question, Netanyahu, yes or no, and many more important questions and crucial questions and fatal questions are even not being discussed. But in any case, Mrs. Omar will be also portrayed in Israel, as in any other place in the Jewish communities, as an anti-Semite, as a dangerous woman, as an enemy of peace, an enemy of Israel, an enemy of the Jewish people. And, you know, the propaganda, this kind of propaganda is very, very efficient. And we just have, I just got so many emails after my last piece, and someone asked me, how can a Jew support such a woman? So I answered him very easily, very, very easily, because she seems to be courageous and she seems to say the truth. And it's about time to say the truth. And yes, Amy, to ask, do we support automatically and blindly the occupation? Is it legitimate to criticize the occupation? Maybe it is legitimate to handle Israel as South Africa was handled. Maybe BDS is something that we should consider. Those questions are even not legitimate to raise in the United States. And maybe now this vicious circle will be broken and people will have the courage, the guts, and the power to ask questions. Yes, everything is questioned. Even God is questionable. So the relations with Israel is not questionable. I saw the other day a congressman say that nobody should question the relations between the United States and Israel. Excuse me? Nobody should question the relations between Israel and the United States? Here from Tel Aviv, I claim that those relationships are corrupted and are bad for peace and bad for Israel for the long run, because the United States let Israel go crazy, continue the occupation, do whatever it wants, and get this automatic and blind support.
Gideon Levy is speaking to us from Tel Aviv, a Jewish reporter with Haaretz newspaper, the Israeli newspaper, and on the editorial board there. Remy Kanazi, you've been tweeting nonstop about this debate unfolding on the floor of the House, a debate amongst Democrats, the more progressive, younger Democrats taking on the leadership of the Democratic Party and the House of Representatives, and clearly having a major effect. What was most significant to you about this week?
Sure. I think that the response to the smearing of Ilhan Omar, right? I mean, what were they seeking to do? They were seeking to smear, to intimidate, and to silence, and they thought that after this week was over that she and others would never speak up again. I think that there was an amazing amount of backlash against what, if you look at the crux of her argument, she talked about Palestinian freedom, justice, and equality. She talked about dignity for all people. So when I think you look at the larger situation, the attacks on Ilhan Omar and Mark Lamont Hill and Angela Davis and Michelle Alexander, communities and people are saying enough is enough. We want to have open and honest discourse on this issue. We want to be able to talk about boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And so I think that it's not just that she's speaking about Palestinian dignity, she's putting action to it and saying we not only need to talk about the suffering, the siege, the blockade and military occupation, we have to cut our direct lines of complicity with occupation and apartheid.
And Phyllis Bennis in Washington, D.C., the whole issue, what you think was talked about and what wasn't?
You know, Amy, I'm very glad that at the beginning of the show you played Congresswoman Omar's actual words. So many of the articles, so much of the discourse in recent days has not been based at all on what she actually said. It's been based on what we think she meant, what it must have been really meaning, whether it was a dog whistle, not on what she said. So, in fact, the Congresswoman is being attacked for anti-Semitic statements she never made, for anti-Jewish prejudices that she doesn't hold, and for a kind of hatred of Jews that she has never expressed. She was being accused of something she never talked about. She never talked about Jews having allegiance to Israel. She talked about the issue of allegiance to Israel by a lobby, which of course includes not only AIPAC, which is one of the most powerful parts of it, but an organization like CUFI, Christians United for Israel, also an incredibly influential component of the pro-Israel lobby. This is not a Jewish lobby. It is a pro-Israel lobby, and it is increasingly Republican. It is very right-wing, and its aim is, as both of my colleagues have said, to shut down the debate, to dim the light, as Congresswoman Omar so poetically put it. But their lights are not going dim. Their lights are brighter than ever. And the extraordinary thing, as both of my predecessors have mentioned, this was a moment when we actually saw the impact in the immediate context of not only outside protests. There were massive demonstrations. There were articles being written. The small piece that I did in The Nation that included mainly the words of Congresswoman Omar was going viral faster than anything I think I've ever written, because people were eager for this. But even within the Congress, what we saw is that the Black Caucus, the Progressive Caucus, not just sort of the young people, this was partly generational for sure, but it was also political. The divide in the Democratic Party over this, between the right and the left, on the questions of U.S. foreign policy, were out there to be seen. And the progressives won. This was an amazing thing where we had an entirely different resolution. There's no doubt that this resolution, like the earlier one, was in response to Democratic leadership fears that there was going to be too much debate about this and it was going to detract from the Democratic agenda, the democracy issues that they want to put on the table. But what we saw was that they actually were forced to listen to other components of the Democratic Party and craft an entirely different resolution that not only didn't name Congresswoman Omar, which the first one didn't either, but it was not aimed solely at the question of anti-Semitism. It was aimed at all the issues of racial and ethnic prejudice that are systemic in this country. It doesn't change the reality. It doesn't stop black people from being shot by police in the streets. It doesn't change the reality of Islamophobia that people have to deal with and live with every day. It doesn't prevent the kind of violence we saw against Jews in Pittsburgh or in Charlottesville. But what it does do is say that this is a new era, that there is a new discourse underway, and that it's no longer going to be possible for the leadership of the Democratic Party or the leadership of Congress or anyone else to assume that they can slap somebody on the wrist for something that they didn't say but that they thought might be interpreted in the wrong way, and then go on as if nothing had happened. Too many people are watching. And as Gideon said, this is a moment when the question of the influence of AIPAC and the influence of Kufi and the influence of the pro-Israel lobby in general is being questioned by a whole set of new actors. When the New York Times has a headline that says, does this show that the influence of, that the power, they said, that the power of AIPAC is too big, and proceeded to write an article that essentially said, yeah, it's too big.
I mean, you have the Wall Street
huge.
Journal tweeting just a week or two ago, AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby, raises more than $100 million a year, which it spends on lobbying politicians for U.S. aid and sending members of Congress to Israel. This isn't Ilhan Omar tweeting this. This is the Wall Street Journal.
We also should note that there have been, someone on Twitter very conveniently put together a list of all the times that the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Chicago Tribune, and the Washington Post have used this term of influence of Israel, of pro-Israel sentiments, attributed to Congress, attributed to the White House, and this notion that somehow only an anti-Semite would use this language, it turns out just isn't true, that allegiance is a word that all these newspapers routinely use. So it goes directly to this point that Ilhan Omar was being targeted not so much for what she said, but for who she was while saying it. That she is a black African immigrant, that she is a Somali refugee, that she is a proud Muslim woman who wears her hijab in the halls of Congress. When she said these things, what was seen as unacceptable, because that can be said by Jewish critics, Christian critics, but if a Muslim critic says it, it's taken as a whole different kind of response. And I think that that's what we have to be very conscious of right now when we have this new, extraordinarily broad and diverse crew of progressives in Congress. This isn't only about identity. It's not just because somebody happens to be a Muslim or happens to be Jewish or happens to be young or happens to be black. It's because we have a bunch of progressives who are young and Jewish and Muslim and black and Latina and whatever that is changing not just the demographics but the politics of how this Congress is operating. And that's a huge shift.
The Congressional Black Caucus also came out in support of Ilhan Omar. I want to ask about this generational shift, Remy, and also the progressive Jewish-Palestinian alliance in this country, not to mention leading African-American intellectuals and activists like Mark Lamont Hill, Angela Davis, Michelle Alexander, coming out in support of Palestinian rights extremely strongly, and then being targeted by the very groups that are very active right now.
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing an incredible sea change. If you look at Black Palestinian Solidarity, Native Palestinian Solidarity. A youth delegation just went over to Palestine. The Dream Defenders delegations, Mark Lamont Hill was on one of them. You look at the Movement for Black Lives endorsing divestment as a way to cut complicity from Israeli occupation and apartheid. So I think that it's happening in the halls of Congress slowly but surely, but it's happening on the ground. You have more than 200 Students for Justice in Palestine chapters in the U.S. and Canada. You have dozens of Jewish Voice for Peace chapters and thousands of members across the country. When you look at Students for Justice in Palestine chapter, you have Black folks, Latinx folks, queer folks, Jewish folks, Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, anti-war socialists, all across the spectrum. So I think that you're looking at Palestine moving into a space where it's becoming a progressive issue. Not in the same way as maybe Medicare for All or Fight for 15, but the way that people are talking about Yemen, the way that people are talking about the U.S.-Mexico border and anti-black racism and the prison industrial complex. People are saying, are you on the side of freedom or are you on the side of apartheid? Are you for liberty for all, or are you looking to marginalize people even further? So I think that that's the question that's really coming up, and that's what's scaring not just bipartisan establishment Democrats and Republicans in Congress, but the AIPACs and Stand With Us and ADL and other groups that are saying, look, black and brown communities, leftist communities are coming together to say enough is enough, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, talking about the right of return for Palestinian refugees, ending the siege on Gaza after 200 people were executed on Friday protests over an 11-month period, or looking at the fact that Israel controls the air, the border, the sea, the imports, the taxes, the tariffs, the population registry, and every facet of life. So even as we talked about Ilhan Omar this week, there was a 15-year-old Palestinian boy that was executed in Gaza. There was a Palestinian village inside of the state of Israel that was demolished for the 141st time. There was home demolitions in the West Bank. So it's about what's being done to the Palestinian people, what side are you standing on, and how can communities come together to battle all forms of injustice.
In fact, it also comes out at the time of the UN Human Rights Council report on what's happening in Gaza and alleging possible war crimes. And Gideon Levy, I was wondering if you can talk about the response to this report in Israel.
The worst thing is that there was no response because it was almost not on the table. I mean, Israel had created itself a shield in which any criticism is immediately delegitimized and immediately ignored and immediately labeled as anti-Semitic, because also this committee is anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli, and nobody would even listen to them. So this committee was another example of how Israel lives in this denial, with, by the way, the collaboration of Israeli media, who hardly had reported about it. I mean, there were some small stories, but nobody really took it too seriously. While we know that for the last months, over 200 people, almost all of them unarmed, were killed in vain, were killed for nothing, and nothing can touch anymore the Israeli society because it is so brainwashed by now, and it became so apathetic and so indifferent to the life of Palestinians. Really, I think there is nothing cheaper in Israel than Palestinian lives. You see day after day, nobody cares. I just wrote 1 week ago a horrible story about soldiers beating up a blind man in his bed. I was sure that at least this, I mean, here you cannot claim anything. He is blind, he is very ill, he lies in the bed at 4 o'clock at night, in the morning. They come into his house by force and start to beat him in his bed. Do you think that anybody reacted to it? Do you think that anybody cared about it? No, Israel closed all the curtains, and we are living in our bubble, so sure that we are always right and the whole world is always wrong, that anybody who dares to say anything about Israel is an anti-Semite. And I must tell you, until now, it was quite efficient, because the fact is that there is still great fear, both in your country and even in Europe, to criticize Israel. There is still great fear to ask major question, like until when will this occupation continue? Until Israel will decide to put an end to it and the world will stand and look at it in indifference and do nothing? Is the world ready for another apartheid state in 2019? So all those questions are hardly discussed here in Israel. We leave the questions of did Netanyahu get free meals or didn't he get free meals? That's more or less the only question which is raised here.
I wanted to play a clip of Sarah Hussein, a member of the UN commission that wrote the UN report, describing how Israeli forces targeted civilians and journalists in Gaza.
We're saying that they have intentionally shot children, they've intentionally shot people with disabilities, they've intentionally shot journalists, knowing them to be children, people with disabilities and journalists. Some of the children, not all of the children are visibly children perhaps, but many of them are.
That was Sarah Hussein. This hardly got any attention, not only in Israel proper, Phyllis Bennis, but of course here in the United States amidst this whole discussion about hate.
You know, this is one of the key points that we have to carry so much further. This was an opening. What happened this week was an opening. It was opening a curtain that has blocked any discussion of this issue. But getting into this issue is now crucial. The question of how the United States has consistently protected Israel in the United Nations so that not Israel as a government and no Israeli official, political or military, can ever be held accountable in the International Court of Justice, in the International Criminal Court for potential war crimes. We don't hear the questions about U.S. complicity. I ran some numbers last night. The U.S. is still sending $3.8 billion every year to the Israeli military, unquestioned about what they do with it. That money, if it was kept at home, I mean, we say 3.8 billion. Nobody knows what that means. We could say a gazillion and it would mean the same thing. But that's real money in the real world. And that same amount of money for 1 year could pay instead for 68,400 new infrastructure jobs, good union jobs to rebuild this country. It could pay for 367,800 veterans getting health care, or it could pay for 426,455 kids to get into Head Start and get a real education starting at a young age. What's going to make us safer in this country? For those who care only about this country, look at those numbers.
I want to end with Remy Kanazi. I've seen almost no Palestinian or Muslim comment in the mainstream media on television around this debate. Does the result of this whole furor this week and the final resolution give you hope?
It does, because I do think that the Palestinian question is being pushed back to the forefront. There are an incredible amount of Palestinian voices, many of whom who have been on Democracy Now! I think that if you look at Congress, what actually created that was the grassroots organizing, was the political action on the ground, was the campus organizing, was the response to the repression that has come from years before. So I think going forward, you're witnessing a sea change. You're seeing people come together in a way that they haven't before. And if you look at Ilhan Omar's comments, she's speaking very frankly and unapologetically. I mean, she was back on Twitter last night with some amazing tweets and, you know, calling out John McCain. So I think that we're going to move forward. I think his daughter as well. Yeah. I think that the Palestinian voice is getting stronger within the United States. It's being seen more within that kind of progressive realm. And I actually think that the Palestinian rights and issues are coming back to the forefront. The right of return for Palestinian refugees, ending the siege on Gaza, building with other communities in different ways on campuses and local communities, and now in the halls of Congress.
I want to thank you very much for being with us, Remy Kanazi. Also, Gideon Levy as Haaretz columnist in Tel Aviv, and Phyllis Bennis, fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, serves on the National Board of Jewish Voice for Peace. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the Lost Children's Archive. Stay with us.
Kayo ba ang mga Maria Clara, mga huli at mga sisa, na di marunong na lumaban, kaapihay bakit iniluluha? Mga babae, kayo ba'y sadyang mahina? Kayo ba ang mga Cinderella na ay buksan at lipunay pag-aralan. Paano nahubog inyong isipan at tanggapin kayo'y mga libangan, mga babae, ito nga ba'y kapalaran? Bakit ba mayroong mga Gabriela?
Woman by Inang Laya. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show with the ongoing crisis at the border. Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen defended President Trump's declaration of a national emergency at the southern border Wednesday, telling lawmakers in an explosive hearing that officials are on track to detain more than 900,000 migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border this year. Nielsen pushed back against widespread reports the Trump administration routinely denies migrants a chance to apply for asylum in the U.S., claiming no one would be turned away at the U.S. port of entry. This is Nanette Barragan of the House Homeland Security Committee speaking at the hearing.
Either you're lying to this committee or you don't know what's happening at the border.
When she was asked how many children remain detained at the border, Nielsen replied she didn't have the number handy. And she denied that migrant prisoners are being held in cages. This is U.S. Homeland Security Committee Chair Benny Thompson questioning Nielsen.
Just yes or no, are we still putting children in cages?
To my knowledge, CBP never purposely put a child in a cage if you mean a cage like this.
Purposely or whatever, are we putting children in cages as of today?
Children are processed at the border facility stations that you've been at. Some of them.
And I've seen the cages. I just want you to admit that the cages exist.
Sir, they're not cages.
What are they?
Areas of the border facility that are carved out for the safety and protection of those who remain there while they're being processed.
Our next guest has seen firsthand what our immigration system does to children who come to this country seeking asylum after working as a volunteer interpreter for children in New York Immigration Court. Valeria Luiselli wrote a celebrated nonfiction book informed by her experience titled Tell Me How It Ends, an essay and 40 questions. She's now out with her fifth book, her first novel written in English, titled Lost Children Archive. Valeria Luiselli, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us and to be here on International Women's Day with you.
Yeah,
the significance, why you wrote Lost Children Archive.
Well, I started writing it on a road trip down to Arizona from New York, and I was trying to write another completely different novel back then about growing up in post-apartheid South Africa. But
you were born in Mexico.
I was born in Mexico, but grew up in several countries, among them South Africa. Right, I arrived in South Africa right when Mandela became president, so it was a very peculiar and beautiful time. I've been trying to write a novel for years about that, which I haven't yet written, really. And I was trying to write it during this trip across the U.S., but the reality in front of me started basically caving in on me. And I started making notes. It was the summer of 2014, exactly when what we can now call the ongoing diaspora of Central Americans fleeing circumstances of unspeakable violence in their countries begun, even though their arrivals began before 2014, but that was the year of the surge. So I started documenting not only traveling across the U.S. in that moment and the landscapes, many times the landscapes of abandonment that I was seeing, but also, of course, the way that the crisis was being recounted and reported on in different states by local newspapers, radio. And so this novel is a novel about immigration, but more than that, it's a novel about how to bear witness and how to tell the story of what I think is going to be one of the most important discussions in the 21st century, which is global diasporas.
And why did you call it Lost Children Archive?
Well, the title, unfortunately, has somehow gained a new meaning now, right? But that is also the power and the elasticity of language. When I first thought of that title, it was my working title in 2014, and I was thinking about children who had lost the right to childhood and children who were not being seen or heard. I was not thinking about children like the children we think of now as lost children who have been lost by this administration's separation policy and having lost track of whose kid is whose parent and are therefore lost within the loop of this system. unfortunately now this title also somehow references at what we think of now as lost children.
You write that Lost Children Archive is more a questioning of how and where we should stand in order to document political violence. Right.
I started writing this novel, and at the same time as I was writing it, I was working as a volunteer screener and translator in the Court of Immigration here in New York, listening to children's testimonies and stories in an attempt to, among many other volunteers, by the way, in an attempt to get their stories clear and then find a lawyer that might represent them and help them against a deportation order. This was right after the priority docket was created by the Obama administration that basically served as a way to expedite removals of undocumented, unaccompanied children. And so, of course, I started using the novel as a kind of depository or vessel of my own political frustration, rage, sadness, confusion. And I also started really ruining the novel, stuffing it with all of that, while also not really doing justice to the issue. I was trying to thread it into a fictional narrative. And so I stopped writing it altogether. I wrote Tell Me How It Ends, which a book that we've spoken about here before, which is a much more straightforward take, a kind of X-ray of the American immigration system, and also an X-ray of this particular diaspora involving children. And once I wrote that book, I was able to return to the novel and think of it as a space that was more multi-layered and less stuffed, more porous, that reflects on where we should stand to bear witness, and not so much, it's not so much a hammer, a political hammer, as it is a space of reflection about our own space of enunciation when we think about political violence.
You've written about your time as an interpreter, saying that children's stories are always shuffled, stuttered, always shattered beyond the repair of a narrative order. The problem with trying to tell their stories is that it has no beginning, no middle, and no end. So this book is a kind of meditation on storytelling, you have said. Explain.
Well, it is. It's a meditation on the politics of the documentary form, first of all, right? About how where the limits of our right to tell another person's story are. Always confusing limit, right? And it's also a meditation on how we hand down stories to the next generation, accounts of the world, narratives around the world, and how that generation rethreads them, recomposes them, and then also gives them back to us. So it's a family that occupies the first half of the novel, or more than the first half, really, that's traveling down towards the border from New York. And the children are listening to their parents talk about the Chiricahua Apaches, in the case of their father. The mother is talking all the time about how to document the crisis at the border, and they're listening to the news. And the kids start confusing bluecoats with Border Patrol and start reenacting a kind of confused history that's also very telling of the way that history also repeats itself in this country, right? The way that it consistently marginalizes those who it sees as lesser citizens or lesser humans, right? And it's black and brown population, fundamentally.
We're going to do part 2 of this discussion and post it online at DemocracyNow.org. Valeria Luiselli, award-winning Mexican-American writer. Her latest book, Lost Children Archive, was just longlisted for the 2019 Women's Prize for Fiction. Thanks so much for being with us. Happy International Women's Day. I'll be speaking March 15th, next Friday, at East High School in Denver, Colorado. Check our website at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.